Okay, class. Good evening. So welcome back. I hope you guys had a good 3-day weekend. And so let me start. I sent you guys an email yesterday, so let me go over that real quick. Okay, so I saw that a lot of people hadn't turned in the first 2 assignments yet on Blackboard, and I know that some students might still be trying to get Microsoft Office, or just some students just out of the class as well. And so I thought it'd be best to give you guys an extra week for the first assignments. And so the only difference for the assignments in the syllabus is that the last week's assignments and today's homework are all not due until next meeting, the next Wednesday. So Chapter 1 homework, Chapter 2 homework, and then we'll do Chapter 3 today. So the first 3 homeworks, last week's and today, will all be due. Nothing's due until next Wednesday. And so if you've already done it, or when you finish it, you might as well post it. But if you need an extra week to do those assignments, then you got that, because I know some people are still catching up. Okay, and if you need to get access to Microsoft Office, if you need Excel or Word or PowerPoint, etc., and you don't have it, then I found out that the University of Laverne provides, they have like an account or a contract with Microsoft, and so you can get Office, the full version or the full student version, just by putting in your email. If you go to this link that I put in the email. So if you just type in your school email address, then it should give you access through the university to the student version of Microsoft Office. So you would obviously click on the student, unless you are a teacher. Okay, and that should see how it, I think you guys can see this, but you can see that this is like through the Laverne portal. Up here you can see it's like through your Laverne section, and then you get access to the student version of all these Office materials. So you got Excel, you got Word, you got PowerPoint, you got all this other stuff, and so you can get, it's not just the online version, you can download and use it on your desktop as well. And so if you need Office, PowerPoint, Word, Excel, then you should be able to get it through the university like I showed you. So let me know if you have any questions doing that. Okay, yeah, that was it. So the due dates for the first 2 assignments are pushed back a week. So homework 1, 2, and 3, or homework chapters 1, 2, and 3, nothing's due until next Wednesday, Wednesday, September 16th. And then if you want to get the student version of Excel or the student version of Office to the university, you can do that as well. Okay, so today we're going to do Chapter 3 in your textbook, which is on supply and demand. So any questions on, looks like, yeah, it looks like a lot of people still need to do the homeworks, Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, but again, you have another week. Does anybody have any questions on the first 2 homeworks? Just because I noticed a lot of people hadn't done them yet. Okay, well, let me know if you need me to cover anything on those homeworks. And, alright, so anything else before we start today's material, which is on supply and demand, chapter 3? Okay, let's go ahead and start today's material. And so I want to cover chapter 3, which is on supply and demand. Okay, so if you go to the study guide section, you can open up the chapter 3 with notes and solutions. We'll use that to start for chapter 3. Okay, and you can go to the PowerPoint section, and you can open up the chapter 3 PowerPoint. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, and then one more thing for chapter 3 is the homework. We'll do that last, but let me just open that up now. And so under homework assignments, I'm going to open up the chapter 3 one, and we'll come to that after we finish the chapter and the example. Okay, so chapter 3 will be on supply and demand. All right, and so you've probably heard of this concept, but we'll go over it in some more detail. And so let's just start with the demand side. Okay, let's review demand and the demand curve, and let's look at slides 3 through 8. Okay, so demand or the demand curve is going to show the relationship between price and quantity demanded for some good or service. All right, so you're essentially looking at how much consumers are willing to pay for some good or service. And we'll look at individual demand, and then we'll kind of add those up and look at market demand. Same kind of concept, but you just kind of add the curves together. So just to look at the law of demand, this essentially states or explains that there's normally an inverse or negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. And so that means it's usually the case that when the price of some good or service goes up, that consumers buy less of it. And when the price of some good or service goes down, consumers buy more of it. And the concept is really simple because either some consumers couldn't afford it and they now come into the market, or some consumers choose to buy more of it because now they can get more with the current income they have. And so for most goods or services, you see a negative relationship between price and demand, and that's what we call the law of demand, and that sets up the demand curve. You've probably seen something like this. where the price of some good is on the y-axis. This example is for lattes, and then the quantity demanded of that good or service is on the x-axis. Okay, so here's price and here's quantity. So you're looking at each price, what would the demand for that good be? In this case, it's lattes. And you normally see, and as it shows, that when the price goes down, demand goes up, and vice versa, when the price goes up, demand goes down. So the demand curve can be steeper or flatter, but it's normally this downward sloping relationship showing that when price changes, the quantity demanded goes the opposite direction. Okay, and you can apply this analysis to any good or service, and normally you get the same relationship where you can look at demand curves for different goods, different services, and see what happens when the price changes. Okay, so all the demand curve is shows what happens to quantity demanded when prices change for that good or service. Nothing else is going on except the price changing and quantity demanded changing in this graph here. Okay, so the concept of market demand is very simple once you understand individual demand. And so if you could sum up all the individual demand curves for some good or service, that comprises the whole market. And so if you simplify it to, looks like we have 3 consumers here. So here's each individual's willingness to pay for lattes. You have Joe Java, you got Sarah Coffee, and you got Mike Cappuccino. Alright, and so the individual demand when the price of lattes changes is represented in this column. And in all the cases, when the price goes down, they buy more of it, but their particular willingness to pay is a little bit different. Right, so they all have their own individual demand curve that looks like this in the next slide. And you'll see that the total market demand, if the market was comprised of just 3 consumers, then you just add up all of the demands at that price, and that's the total market demand at each price. Okay, so this is Joe, Sarah, and Mike's individual demand curves. Alright, and so here's Joe's willingness to pay for lattes, Sarah's willingness to pay for lattes, and Mike's. And if we only have those 3 consumers, the way to get the market demand is just to add them all together. So obviously you have, in a real latte market, you can have many more than 3 consumers, but you get the idea is that the market demand is just a summation of all the individual demand curves. Alright, and so at $3, Joe demands 35, Sarah demands 39, and Mike demands 26. And that, if you add all those together, then total market demand at $3 per latte is 35 plus 39 plus 26, which is a nice 100. Okay, so that introduces demand and market demand. But now we're going to get into some things which would change or shift the demand curve. So the next slide, slide 8. Alright, this illustrates what would happen if you had an increase or decrease in demand at a particular price. And so we'll look at some things that cause increases and decreases in demand or demand shifts. But you see the concept that the middle one is the initial demand curve, D1. Now, if something caused demand to increase at each price, then an increase goes this way, right, to the right. And if something caused demand to decrease each price, a decrease goes this way or leftward. So the way you look at it as if you keep price constant and demand is high, demand increases, then see at $3, with an increase, the market's willing to pay more, or with a decrease at $3, they're willing to pay less. Okay, so increase in demand, the curve kind of shifts out like this, and decrease, it shifts to the left like this, again representing that the demand at a particular price has changed. Okay, so if we got demand, we'll show the relationship, the negative relationship between price of some good or service and quantity demanded. Let's look at some things that might shift or cause the demand curve to change. All right, so back to the study guide. Okay, so this section is called demand shifters, and these are things which by name shift the demand curve. And so there's a bunch of different things. If you look in textbooks, if you look in our textbook, there's all kinds of things that can shift the demand curve. I usually focus on a couple different types, and the first category is this one, where you look at how income affects demand, and you break that down into two types, which are called normal goods and inferior goods, and we'll talk about those in a second. And then the second kind of subcategory of demand shifters is the price of related goods, and that'll bring us to substitutes and complements. Okay, so we're going to understand the concept of demand shifters by looking at two types of income related shifts and then two types of related goods, and we'll categorize those sections. Normal goods versus inferior goods, that'll tackle income, and then substitutes versus complements, that'll look at prices of related goods. Okay, so let's first start with income, which will bring us to normal goods and inferior goods. So if we go to slide 9, Alright, so for now, let's focus on changes in income and how those changes in income affect the demand curve or the relationship between price and demand. Okay, so if income changes, you almost always see something happen to the market. Either the consumers on average buy more or the consumers on average buy less. Now, you'd think that they'd always buy more, and that's normally the case, which is why the normal goods category is that, and so normal goods have basically quantity demanded has a positive relationship with income, and so let me write that here in the chat. Okay, so normal goods mean that quantity demanded and income have a positive relationship, and that simply means that when income goes up, quantity demanded goes up, and vice versa. Alright, so you have a positive relationship, which is what you would expect if the consumers get a raise or get a tax refund or something like that. If they get more income, you would expect them to buy more of that good or service. But you can also have another type of good called inferior goods. Okay, in inferior goods, you have the complete opposite relationship, which is that when income changes, demand goes the other direction. So you basically have a negative relationship between income and quantity demanded. And it sounds a little weird, but we'll think of an example here in a minute. So let me write the definition of inferior goods here in the chat. Okay, so inferior goods, quantity demanded, and income have a negative relationship. Okay, and so most goods go into the normal good category, but it helps to think of something that might go into the inferior good. So let's see if we can think of some examples of what might be categorized as an inferior good. Okay, so basically what this means is that when you have consumers of good or service, that if they get more income, they buy less of this good, and if they get less income, they buy more of it. So it has the opposite direction of a normal good. So can anybody think of some examples of what might be classified as an inferior good? In other words, if the consumers have less income, they buy more of it, and if they get more income, they buy less of it. There's lots of things, but can we think of some examples of those inferior goods? Yeah, that's a good example. So store brand food cans, because that can serve as a meal. And if you have a lower income, or your income drops for some reason, like a lot of people has recently, then you might switch to store brand food cans, because you can still eat it. It's a meal, but if you had more income, you might choose to buy something else, like a restaurant meal, or some fresh meat at the butcher or something like that. Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah. Yeah, bus travel as well, right? Because you might prefer to have your own car. You might prefer to take an Uber or whatever, or some more fancier way of travel. But if your income has gone down or something like that, yeah, exactly. So you guys get the idea. So yeah, both of those are really good examples. Okay, so if I can bring us back to the so what we're trying to say is that, like, if one of these things changes, if income changes, then what happens to demand for these goods and services? So basically, let me do it both ways. So if we're looking at if store brand food cans are an inferior good, okay, so then the logic here is that an increase in income would cause a decrease in demand for store brand food cans, right? Because you can now switch to things that you probably prefer instead. And the same would go the other way. If you had a decrease in income, alright, so if they're both inferior goods, then also a decrease in income would cause an increase in demand for bus travel. So the relationship is opposite. And so you get the idea here that whichever cause you had, right, if we were looking at an increase in income, will cause a decrease in demand for store brand food cans. That would mean that demand would go this way, right? And if a decrease in income would cause an increase in demand for bus travel, an increase in demand would be this way. Okay, so the second type of subcategory under demand shifters is to look at the price of some related good. All right, so we looked at income, and now let's look at the price of related goods, which will bring us to substitutes and complements. Okay, so back to the PowerPoint. All right, so if there's a change in the price of some good that's related to this good or service, then you can break that down into those two goods would either be complements or could be complements, or they can also be substitutes. Okay, so let me write a simple definition of complements and substitutes, and we'll see if we can think of an example of two goods that might you can categorize as the two. So complements are two goods in which you consume them together, right? So these are goods that are complementary. So the simple definition, I guess, is just goods in which you must consume together. All right, so good X and good Y are complements. The consumer must consume those two goods together, and so the goods are complementary. So can we think of examples of two goods which might be considered complements? So like we need two goods here. So good X and good Y, both of which could be complementary to each other. So what are two examples of goods that might be complementary? So can we think of a good X and a good Y, which the consumer would probably consume together? Yeah, exactly. Gas in the car, right? You can't drive a car without gas. Right. Cigarettes and a lighter, those two things you need together. Chicken breast and cooking oil, sure, that would work as well. Yeah, so all these things would work because assuming that you need both goods to consume the bundle, if you will, then yeah, those are all complements. Okay, and so you see the idea, if you look at the shifts in the demand curve, is that if one of the prices changes, or if the price of some related good changes, then what happens to the demand for the good you're graphing? So let me display the question, and then we'll look at it from both sides. So this is how we look at it. If the price of lighters increases, then what happens to the demand for cigarettes? So that's the question I'm asking you guys. So if these are complements, if the price of lighters increases, what happens to the demand for cigarettes? Yes, exactly, right? Because, yeah, exactly. So it decreases because you've got to consume these together. And so if the price of lighters goes up, you have a little bit less money to spend on cigarettes. So therefore your demand for the complementary good, has to go down because you're spending more of your relative income on lighters. So, right, exactly. Okay, and you can also look at it from the other side. So you probably already know the answer here, but if we ask the question for the other good going down, okay, so we already know the answer to this, but just so you see it in the appropriate question, that if the price of gasoline decreases, then what happens to the demand for driving cars? And so obviously, if the complementary good became cheaper, then the demand for driving cars would increase. Okay, so I think we got complements, right? So what about substitutes? Okay, substitutes are goods that are substitutes for each other. So a general definition, I guess, is you have good X and good Y. And the consumer, they're similar goods, they're very similar goods. And so based on price, the consumer can substitute good X for good Y based on which one is cheaper. All right. And so we can think of examples of these, but let me write kind of a simple definition of substitutes. All right. So good X and good Y are substitutes if the consumer is essentially indifferent between both goods. They both provide the same level of satisfaction. They're similar types of goods. And so the good with the cheaper price is consumed more because it's a better value given the fact that they're substitutes. So can we think of two examples of substitute goods? Okay, so examples. So first statement was substitute a lighter for a matchbox. Yeah, that would work because assuming you're using it for the same exact thing, then yes. So yeah, if you can define anything as a substitute as long as the consumer consumes it such. So yeah, if both things are used for like lighting cigarettes or lighting a stove or whatever, then yeah, that would work. And yeah, Pepsi and Coke are definitely a classic example of substitutes because you'll notice that in a store, they're the same size, they're pretty much the same price unless there's a sale. And so a lot of the ways that Coke or Pepsi get customers is they'll have like flash sales because they get people on the margin to switch over. And so you probably have customers that only buy Coke and only buy Pepsi. But a lot of people, or a lot of customers only care about price, and therefore like a cheaper price would induce more customers to buy that good on the margin. So both those work. All right, so you get the idea here that the effect of the related good for two substitutes is the opposite direction. So I'll just phrase the question, and that way you'll see what I mean. Okay, if the price of Pepsi increases, what happens to the demand for Coca-Cola? So we get the idea that if the substitute good is more expensive now, then there'll be an increase in demand for those consumers on the margin, and we see an increase in demand for Coca-Cola. Okay, and the same would work for the opposite direction, just to complete the analysis. Alright, if the price of matches decreases, what happens to demand for lighters? If the consumer is just using these things for the same service, like they just need something to light their cigarette, or something to light their stove, or they're using it to ignite something, then they're substitutes, so there'll be a switch or an increase in demand. A decrease in demand for lighters because now matches are cheaper. Okay, so I think we got or understand the difference between substitutes and complements and inferior versus normal goods. Yeah, so let's go on to the next item. Okay, so we covered some things on the demand side. Now let's look at the supply side. So let's look at the supply curve and the law of supply starting on slide 12 to 15. Okay, so supply shows the relationship between the price of some good or service and the quantity supplied for that good or service. And so it's on the same axes where you look at price and quantity, but it looks at how much the firm or the market would supply at each price for that good. And the law of supply is the complete opposite, or not the complete opposite, but it's the opposite direction of what we talked about with the law of demand. So when the law of supply states that when the price goes up, the supply of that good or service goes up. All right, so there's a positive relationship. or when the price goes down, the quantity supplied goes down. Right? So this makes total sense that when the price of a good can be sold higher, then firms supply more of it because they're getting more revenue, and vice versa. Okay, so here is a typical supply curve. We're looking at lattes again, and you can see that every time the price goes up, the individual supply goes up as well, and also the market supply. Right? So as price goes up from 1 to 2 to 3, then firms will supply more of it because they're getting more revenue at each prevailing price. Okay, so this is price on this axis, and this is quantity, and then you see that every time the price goes up, the quantity supplied of this good, lattes, also goes up. Okay, and what happens if there's an increase or decrease in supply, or something shifts the supply curve? If something causes an increase in supply, it goes this way, outward to the right, and if there's a decrease in supply, it goes the opposite direction, or leftward or up. All right, so you can just pick a price 3, and if we start here, and supply goes up, then you can see that at that same price, the supply is greater. And if the supply goes down, you can see at the same price, supply is low. So make sure that the outward shift, the shifting to the right, is an increase. So even though it goes down, this is an increase in supply. And even though this one goes up, this is a decrease. So just look at it at each price. If the quantity supplied is higher, this is an increase. And if the quantity supplied is lower, then this is a decrease. Okay, so let's look at some things that would shift the supply curve in those directions. Okay, so supply shifters, let's cover those on slides 16 through 17. Alright, so there's a whole bunch of them here. There's a whole bunch of them in your textbook. I usually just focus on a few of them because once you get the main ones, you get the idea. Alright, so let's cover resource prices, technology, and then we'll talk about taxes and subsidies because that's an important one too. Alright, so a resource price is like an intermediate good that goes into the production process. So if we're looking at, if we're looking at matches, like we just talked about, then there's one of the resource prices that goes into producing matches is wood, because you need wood to make the match. So let me phrase the question, and then we'll see how the resource price change affects the supply curve. Alright, so I think I phrased this okay. So if the price of wood, a resource price in producing matches, that should have been in the parentheses, but if the price of wood, a resource price in producing matches increases, what happens to the supply of matches? So this will help us understand it that, so it takes wood's one of the goods that you go into producing matches. Alright, so if the price for that just buying wood increases for the supplier, then what happens to the supply of matches? Yes, that's correct, because now it's more expensive at each price to produce it. Alright, so you see that a resource price increase has a negative effect or decreases supply or shifts it to less, because now the firm's got to pay more just to get the final good out there, so that would decrease supply, correct. Okay, so resource prices have a negative relationship with quantity of supply. Okay, so what about, let's look at a few more. Technology is a big one because this happens frequently. So technological improvement or like a boost in technology would allow the firm to produce more of the good or service with the same amount of resources. So normally this is like an improvement in technology. So I'm phrasing a question so we get to what happens when technology changes. Okay, so if the technological improvement in Pepsi production, what would happen to the supply of Pepsi? Alright, so now with the same resources, nothing else changing, the firms or the whatever companies, factories can produce more Pepsi, given the technological improvement. So obviously you can see that if you can produce more with the same resources, they're going to produce more Pepsi. So the supply of Pepsi is going to increase. Alright, so let's look at let's discuss taxes and subsidies, and I think we got it for what shifts, or we got the main things that shift supply. Okay, so taxes and subsidies work in the opposite direction, and so a tax on every unit supplied would increase the production cost, and then a subsidy is like a payment or a stipend that you get in the supply process, so that would be good for supply. All right, so let me think of two goods that might be taxed. Actually, we've already discussed one. Then you can see what happens to the supply of that good. So if the tax is imposed on every unit of cigarettes supplied, what would happen to supply of cigarettes? And so you can clearly see that this is an increase in production costs. because now they're paying an additional fee every time they supply it. So that's going to have a negative effect on suppliers of cigarettes. So that's going to cause a decrease in supply. And then a subsidy would work in the opposite direction. That's good for suppliers. And so something that might be subsidized, and so cigarettes are often taxed, and something that's often subsidized, especially in California, is like solar panels or solar energy production. So if a subsidy is given for every unit of solar PV panels supplied, what would happen with suppliers? So if they're getting a payment for every unit they supply, they're going to supply more of them because it's good for suppliers and firms. So supply would increase for solar panels. Okay, so if we have an increase in resource prices or tax, that's going to decrease supply. And if we have an increase for a boost in technology or a subsidy, that's going to increase supply, and supply will go this way, increase. Okay, all right, I think we get the determinants of supply and how that causes it to shift. All right, so just know the ones we talked about there, resource prices, what happens there, technology, and then taxes and subsidies. Okay, next thing is market equilibrium. So we talked about demand, we talked about supply, but these two curves can come together, and this helps determine the market price and market quantity of that good or service supplied and demanded. All right, so let's look at equilibrium on slide 19. Okay, so here we go. We're still looking at lattes as an example of the PowerPoint here. And so here's the supply curve for lattes. Here's the demand curve, downward sloping. And so there's, in theory, some price. In this case, it's $3, in which the quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal. And so that would be the market supply and market quantity, which would be market price of $3 and a market quantity of 7, assuming nothing changes. So that's how you bring both of the forces together, and in theory, this is what determines the price of the good and how much is sold in the market for some good or service. All right. Next thing is we got demand, we got supply, we got what happens or what causes those curves to shift, and then we got market equilibrium. So if we have market equilibrium and one of those curves shifts, or both of those curves shift, one or the other, then what happens as a result of those shifters? Okay. So now let's look at changes in the market equilibrium if one of the curves, or sometimes two of the curves, shifts. Okay, so changes in demand, supply, and then therefore what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity. We can cover those in slides 21 to 23. Okay, if just one of the curves changes, then you can kind of see the result. All right, so if you have a market equilibrium with S and D1, and then something happens to demand, what happens to the new price and quantity? Okay, so here, if you start here at D1 and S, and there's an increase in demand, goes out to D2, then you can see the new result is a higher market price and a higher market quantity. All right, so that should make total sense because if nothing else changes except an increase in demand, then those consumers are willing to buy at higher prices, and there'll be more suppliers that can supply at those higher prices. So essentially the consumers are bidding up the price, and there'll be a higher amount supplied because more suppliers, in particular this amount here, would either supply more or enter the market, and the result is if demand shifts increases to the right, then the new market price is higher, and the new market quantity is higher as well. You can probably guess that if nothing happens except for a decrease in demand, the new equilibrium is the result of a lower price and a lower quantity because now consumers aren't going to pay as much, and so therefore there's a drop in the price. They're saying we're not going to pay as much for this good or service, and therefore some consumers leave the market and the price is pushed down. Okay, so demand goes up, the result is market price increases, market quantity increases. Demand goes down, the result is market price decreases, and market quantity also decreases. Okay, what about if supply shifts? And so if you start an equilibrium at, on the left side you got D and S1, and supply increases. Right, shifts to the right from one of those things we talked about. Either there's a technological improvement, a subsidy, resource price decreases, or tax decreases, something like that, something that causes supply to increase. The new result you can see that suppliers would now be willing to supply at lower prices, so that pushes the price down. And if there's more suppliers in the market, then market supply increases. Okay, so supply increases. The conclusion is the new market price is lower and the new market price is higher. The new market quantity is higher, sorry. Okay, whereas if supply were to decrease like this, we start at S3 and D, and supply decreases, shifts to the left from one of those factors. We have a tax or something, and that's going to result in the fact that suppliers need higher prices now to supply, to offset that decrease in supply. So that pushes the price up, and we get a new higher market price. And there's less suppliers now, so the market equilibrium is down. So supply decreases, the result is a higher market price, a lower market quantity. Okay, and there's also a case, I don't have a picture of it right here, but you can also have a situation in which both both curves change, which is often the case, because a lot of times when demand changes, supply follows as well. Like if there's a big increase in demand for some good or service, it's very likely that supply is going to increase to match that change in demand. So you often have two curves shifting, and you're trying to figure out the new market price and quantity. So we're not going to draw those curves, but we'll cover these. I have in the example, there's a question that covers this. There's a nice little chart, and I'll explain there, but basically what you can see is, and what we'll do in the example is that if both curves change, you can determine the partial result. But if you don't know the magnitudes of the curve shifts, and then you don't know the full new result, so you can state like this is going to go up, but the effect of this is indeterminate. And I'll explain that in a little bit when we look at the examples, but you can analyze part of it, but it's complex for a reason because you don't know the magnitude. So in the example on the study guide, and I think in some of the homework questions, we can be able to talk about what happens if both curves change and what that does in a new pricing quantity. Okay, so we'll cover that in a minute, or a little later. All right, so final two concepts in Chapter 3 are government set prices, which we'll look at as a price ceiling or a price floor. So the last few slides are those things, and we'll look at those. Everybody doing okay so far? All right, let's look at the price ceilings first on slides 24 and 25. Okay, so price ceilings are exactly what they mean. Is that so normally you have a if there's no interferences or there's no disturbances to the supply and demand, right? If market forces work correctly, which sometimes they do, but not often, you would just have a price in supply determined by supply and demand. But sometimes the government steps in and wants to do something or impose a certain price at a maximum or minimum. And so the first type of this price we'll look at that comes into this market, or this supply and demand analysis, is a price ceiling. Okay, and like the graph will show, that this is a price that's set below what would be the result of a perfect equilibrium. Okay, and this is a classic example of this is rent control situations. Okay, so if you use this example as rent control, which means that this is the supply of rent, like this is the supply of rental houses or rental apartments on the supply axis, and this is the demand for renting or rental units. Okay, and so in theory, if there were no price ceiling, then the result, the price would be this, T0 and Q0. Okay, but sometimes there's other reasons why the government wants to interfere and they want to set a price, a ceiling on the price, and that ceiling might look like this, PC, where the price is set below the market clearing price. And if that's the case, this analysis would tell us that at PC, This is supply at that price. This is demand. And you can see that there's clearly more people that are willing to rent or to buy or to consume at that price, but not enough suppliers. These suppliers, this little part here, so this section of the supply curve, they're not able to supply because they can't supply at this low price. And also this little portion of the demand curve, as you can see with the mouse, those consumers aren't able to buy housing or buy rental units because there's not enough, there's a shortage. Okay? So this is the result of the economic result of rent controls. There's other reasons why you might want to impose a rent control that aren't covered in this graph. Especially now, like you might want people to stay in one place. You might want to, encourage longevity in an area, but this is what a price control or a price ceiling situation would look like, and the result is a shortage. Okay. Next or final concept is the other government set price, which is a price floor. Okay, and then by definition, the price here is set above the market price. And a common example, a textbook example of this, which is studied in magnitude in economics, is minimum wage law. Okay, so if you look at the graph here, this is if we're looking at minimum wage laws, this would be the supply of labor. So these are the workers or potential workers, and then demand would therefore be the demand for labor. So these are the firms or businesses. So make sure you get it that this is workers on supply. They're supplying labor, and demand is the demand for labor. So that's the firms. Okay, so in theory, if there was no price floor, this would be the price, P0 and Q0, which suppliers of labor and demanders of labor, firms, agree upon. But if there's a price floor which is set above the market clearing price, then the result would be a floor, and that looks like this TF here. Alright, so if that's the new floor, you can't, prices below that are not allowed but in this market, or I guess they're illegal. And so at that price, demand is less than supply, right? So you have a surplus because supply is bigger than demand at this price. And these consumers, if you can see that, are cut out of the market. They're not able to buy at that higher price, and then these suppliers of labor, these workers don't get a job because they're willing to work at lower wages, but there's not enough jobs to go around. Okay, so this is how you result in a surplus of government set prices, right? So there's essentially more workers than can get a job. Because of the government set price floor. But there's again, just like the other case, there's other reasons why you might want to have a minimum wage. You might want to, you don't want people working for, 50 cents an hour, and at least you know what the minimum level is. But what this analysis says is there might be people that would and do supply their labor cheaper than the minimum wage. And that's the surplus we see here, where there's more workers than can get employment. Okay, so those are all the key concepts I wanted to cover in the supply and demand chapter. And we got a bunch of examples. And any questions on anything we've covered so far? Okay, all right, seems like we're okay. Anybody need a 5-minute break? Keep going. We're good? Okay. So, I have so we went through the key concepts, and there's a couple optional videos which I normally would show in class, but we're not going to watch those remotely, but if you get a chance, look at these 2 videos on supply and demand. And so they help explain the concepts and talk about those in those quick videos. They're only like 5 or 10 minutes. So watch those videos when you get a chance if you want to. All right, so let's go to some examples, and this will help us understand the supply and demand concepts, hopefully. So number 1 is just a few statements, and then we determine what happens to the demand for a good. Okay, so number 1, what effect will each of the following have on the demand for small automobiles such as the Mini Cooper and the Smart Car? So statement 1, part A. So all we have to do is state the effect on demand. Small automobiles become more fashionable, so that's just like a trend or an increase in, that's going to cause an increase in demand because now they're more fashionable. And so if consumers respond to fashion or respond to things being more trendy, which they do, then demand will increase. Alright, so if small automobiles are trending, then that's an increase in demand. B, the price of large autos rises, so this is a related good, with the price of small autos remaining the same. So if bigger autos become more expensive and nothing happens to the price of small autos, you're going to see people on the margin switch to smaller autos because now they're relatively a little bit cheaper, so that's going to cause an increase in demand as well. Okay, C, income declines and small autos are an inferior good. So remember we classified inferior good as a negative relationship or inverse relationship between income and demand for that good. So if this is an inferior good and income goes down, then by definition, because it's an inferior good, demand's going to increase because it's an inferior good. Okay, D, consumers anticipate that the price of small autos will greatly come down in the near future. So this one's a little weird, but if we're talking about the demand for these autos now, and so this is like if let's say it's like August, and you know that all the car companies will have sales in like the winter months, like there's normally sales around December and the holidays. So if you know the prices are going to come down in a month, a lot of consumers will wait for the lower price of the deal, like the holiday sale, or maybe often the prices go down in January because the new models come out and the car companies want to sell the older cars at lower prices to get rid of them. So if you anticipate a cheaper price in the future, your demand now is going to go down, so demand decreases. Okay, and then E, the price of gasoline substantially drops. And the reason why this one's a little tricky, this is ambiguous, if you don't know what's going to happen, is because there's two things that can happen. So one, gasoline is cheaper, you buy more small cars and smart cars. Or two, now this makes less fuel-efficient cars like SUVs and trucks essentially cheaper too. So you often don't know if consumers are going to buy them now because both things are now cheaper, given the price of gasoline. So the switch in consumption is ambiguous because this might lead to an increase in demand for like SUVs, or it might lead to an increase in demand for just even cheaper smart cars, but you can't really determine it until you know consumer behavior. All right, number two, what will each of the following have? What effects will each of the following have on the supply of auto tires? So A, you have a technological advance in the methods of producing tires. So remember, that's a technological boost. And an increase in technology is going to boost supply. Supply is going to increase. B, a decline in the number of firms in the tire industry. So there's less sellers, then by definition, supply goes down. Supply decreases. C, an increase in the price of rubber used in the production of tires. So that, remember, that's like an input price or a resource price. It's now more expensive for suppliers, and therefore they're going to supply less. Supply is going to decrease. Okay, these are a little tricky. The expectation that the equilibrium price of auto tires will be lower in the future than currently. And so, remember, this is supply, and they want to have higher prices to sell at. And so, if the suppliers know that the price is going to come down in the future due to holiday sales or end-of-year sales, they'd like to supply more now at a higher price, because when it comes to lower prices, they're getting less revenue per car, and so the supply of tires now is going to increase. Okay, E, a decline in the price of large tires used for semi-trucks and earth hauling rigs with no change in the price of auto tires. Okay, so this is like a similar but different good. So if tires for those semi-trucks and big earth hauling rigs go down, then factories or firms that could supply the auto tires at the now higher rate, because relatively it's higher revenue, they're going to supply more of it because this price is the same, and the other good they could have sold is less valuable. So supply of auto tires increases. Okay, and then part F, the levying of a per unit tax on each auto tire sold. This is a tax. This is bad for firms and suppliers, so they're going to decrease supply if they're given a tax or a tax increase, so supply decreases. And then G, last one, the granting of a 50-cent per unit subsidy for each auto tire sold. So that's good for suppliers. They get paid to supply. So subsidies increase supply. So therefore here, if there's a subsidy, supply of auto tires increases. Okay, example number three. So this one covers the changes in, so we start with the equilibrium, and then if we shift one of the curves, what happens to the new price and new quantity. But this also covers if both supply and demand simultaneously shift, which is often the case, how can we determine the result? So let's see if we can make sense of this. How will each of the following changes in demand and or supply affect equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity in a competitive market? So that is, the price and quantity rise, fall, or remain unchanged, or are the answers indeterminate because they depend on the magnitude of those shifts? Okay, so magnitudes of the shifts mean that's how far the curve shifts. All right, so if that is unknown, often it's impossible to determine some of the results, but you can get some of it. So this chart here is a nice summary of if both curves shift, what's the result. So this shows, and we'll come back to the chart, but you can use this when you're doing homework questions or etc. So if there's an increase in supply and an increase in demand, this is the result. And if there's a decrease in supply and an increase in demand, this is the result. And so we can use this, or you can use this chart to help validate your answer, but I still want you guys to know what the conclusion is. Okay, so we have 8 cases. The simple ones are the one curve shifts we already covered, but let's go over them real quick. And then we have some cases where both curves shift. Alright, so I just simplified where P star is the market price, and then Q star is the market quantity. So that's just, I use P star and Q star as notation for market price and market quantity. Okay, so the exercise here is what happens to those variables after the change. So we're in equilibrium and then something happens. Here, part A, supply decreases and demand is constant. So remember, if supply decreases, you know the new price goes up, you get a higher market price and a lower market quantity. Okay, so we covered that in the slides. And we also saw that when just demand decreases and supply is constant, that market price goes down and market quantity goes down. If supply increases and demand is constant, the new market price goes down and the new market quantity goes up. Okay, so let's come back to D because D is a double shift. But E, demand increases and supply is constant. So we saw in the graphical analysis that the new market price goes up and the new market quantity also goes up. Okay, so the rest of them are what would happen if both curves shift. All right, and so you don't have to memorize this, but you can look at the chart to verify. So what if demand increases and then also supply increases? So both curves are changing. So it's often the case that if demand for a good increases, then supply follows it and also increases. So what if both those things happen? Okay, so you can look at the chart, but also understand that you can figure it out just by logic. So if demand increases, that means the consumers will pay higher prices. If supply increases, that means they'll supply at lower prices, and you don't really know which one is going to dominate, which one is the bigger magnitude. So therefore, if the demand change is pushing the price up, and the supply change is pushing the price down, the final effect on the new market price is indeterminate at this point. And so the question mark means indeterminate or ambiguous because you don't know, it depends on the magnitude of the shift. Okay, but you know for sure that if demand goes up and supply goes up, the result has to be a higher market quantity. So the new price is indeterminate, but the new market price is going to be higher. All right. What if if there's two curves shifting, there's four cases. We've done one. So there's this case, this case, this case, and this case. All right. If supply increases and demand decreases, okay, then you already know that if one curve goes up and one curve goes down, you don't know which one is going to win out on the quantity shift. So if supply and demand go opposite directions, then the effect on quantity is indeterminate. But even without knowing the magnitude, you know the new market price will be lower because when supply goes up, they'll supply at lower prices. And when demand goes down, they need lower prices to buy. So both those shifts push the price down, the price has to go down. Okay, so the result here is the new market price is lower and the new market quantity is indeterminate. Okay, so a couple more. Hopefully this makes sense, or is making some sense. And you can always look at the chart for to verify your answer when you're doing the homework and such. So what if demand increases, the demand curve increases, and also what follows is the supply curve decreases? Okay, so here we go. If demand increases, they'll pay higher price. The consumers have said they'll pay higher prices. And if supply decreases, they've determined that they need higher prices to supply now. So both those things are pushing the price up. The price is definitely going up after the changes. But we don't know which of the curves is going to dominate in terms of demand going up and supply going down. Which one is the bigger magnitude? We don't know that. So the effect on the new quantity in the market is indeterminate at this time. Okay, the final case is when demand goes down and demand goes down and also supply goes down. All right, so we already know that if both curves decrease, the new market quantity has to be lower. Market quantity is going down. Okay, and if demand goes down, they're saying we need lower prices to buy. If supply decreases, they're saying we need higher prices to supply. Now that's pressure on the price in both directions. You don't know which one is going to win out. So the final effect on the new market price is indeterminate. But we know for sure, like we said, that the new market quantity goes down. Okay, so these are all the cases that you can be expected to talk about. This chart summarizes the double shifts or two curve shifts, so the four cases there. So that was a lot of stuff. Any questions on what we just talked about here? Okay, well, you can always refer to the examples in the chart, but I do want you to understand why the result is as it is. But all right, so there's a few more on supply and demand in the both curve shifting. Okay, so if both supply and demand change and you have a little bit more information, sometimes you can determine the result. So number 4, suppose both the demand for olives and the supply of olives decline by equal amounts over some period of time. So state the effect on equilibrium pricing quantities. Okay, so we're doing the same analysis. What happens to price? What happens to quantity? If the demand for olives and the supply of olives both decline, but it says here by equal amounts. Okay, so that means that the decrease in demand and the decrease in supply are the exact same magnitude, or like when both curves shift, they're the same distance. Okay, and so if you were to draw the graph and look at the result, so you know that if both supply and demand go down, the new market quantity is lower because there's less buyers and less sellers. So the new quantity is low. Okay, but you can also determine that only because the shifts are the same magnitude, or the same amount. Okay, so demand goes down, they need lower prices. Supply goes down, they need higher prices. But those effects offset because they're the exact same magnitude. So therefore, the result is that the two shifts in supply and demand are going to cancel out, and the effect of price is going to stay the same. And the only result is a lower market quantity because we have to have that. There's less buyers and less sellers. Okay, so again, make sure you understand why that, so when demand goes down and supply goes down, we did that up here. And we know that the new market quantity goes down. So the reason why it was indeterminate was this in part H for the previous question is because we didn't know the magnitudes. But number 4, we know the magnitudes. We don't know the magnitudes, but we know they're the same. If we know they're the same, then the price is going to be offset, no change, and we can determine this. Okay, so depending on the information you're given in the problem, or the research, you can determine different effects given the specific information. Okay, number 5, let's assume that both the supply of bottled water and the demand for bottled water rise during the summer months, but that supply increases more rapidly than demand. So we're given another specific piece of information. And so what can you conclude about the directions of the impacts on equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity? Okay, so both supply and demand increase, and we know right away, right, that the new market quantity is going to be higher because both the curves have shifted increase. Okay, so we're starting with this case. And we got that. And here we didn't know the magnitudes. And here we don't know the magnitudes, but we know that supply increases more rapidly than demand. So if the magnitude of the supply curve shift is bigger, then we can figure out, or then we know the result, right? So if supply goes down, if supply goes up, they'll supply at lower prices. If demand goes up, they'll buy at higher prices. So again, both those things are putting opposite direction pressure on the price. Demand shift is pushing the price up. Supply shift is pushing the price down. But we know right away that because the supply increase is bigger, that's the result. Right? So if the supply magnitude shift is bigger, that's the result of the change. That wins out, and so supply pushes the price down, and that's a result. Okay, so the new market price is lower, the new market quantity is higher, and that's only because the magnitude of the supply curve shift is bigger than the other magnitude. Right? So again, your conclusion is based on the information you're given and the whole process. Okay, a few more examples. Number 6. Let's use the table below to answer the following questions. Answer the questions that follow. So we have this is the price of some good or service, and these are the prices. And then at each of these prices, this is quantity demanded in thousands, and this is quantity supplied in thousands. Okay, so let's use a little chart or the data to answer the questions. Okay, A. If this table reflects the supply and demand or tickets to a particular World Cup soccer game, what is the stadium capacity? Okay, so if you look at stadium capacity or the number of seats, is essentially the supply. Right? So if this is supply and demand for World Cup soccer tickets, then supply is how many seats. Okay, and you can clearly see that supply is always 60,000, and that's because in this type of market, the supply doesn't change because there's 60,000 seats, and that's the stadium capacity. So it's always 60. Look at the supply column. And so in this example, you should see that represents the stadium capacity, which is quantity supplied. So here, the stadium capacity is 60,000 seats. Okay, B, if the pre-sold ticket price is $45, what would we expect to see a secondary market for tickets, and would the price of a ticket in the secondary market, which I guess already answered the question, be higher than, the same as, or lower than the price in the original market? So if you look at what we're talking about here, if the pre-sale or if the ticket price is set at $45, there's 60,000 seats, and if you look at supply, there's 70,000 customers that want to buy at this price. So what that means, or what that tells you, is that the demand is higher than the current price. So there's going to be more consumers that want to buy at $45 than can fit in the stadium. And so normally what happens here is you get a secondary market, like a StubHub or a Ticketmaster, in which will buy some of the tickets and sell them at higher prices because many consumers are willing to pay higher prices than $45. So you get a secondary market selling at higher prices because there's consumers that would pay up to over $45 for this particular seat. Okay, and then part C, let's suppose some other World Cup soccer game, or some other World Cup soccer game, the quantity of tickets demanded is 20,000 lower at each ticket price than in the diagram. Alright, so if the ticket price remains at 45, would the event be a sellout? So what this one's saying is to subtract 20,000 from each. So the new quantity demanded is 20,000 less. Okay, so take away 20. So like this is that's now 60. This is now 55. Okay, so for part C, the second column for demand is now the appropriate one. So if the price is $45 with the lower demand, you can see that in this case, quantity supply is 60,000, demand is 50,000. So if at that price, there's not even enough consumers that want to pay that price. So there's going to be no secondary market here. The event's not going to sell out because there's 10,000 seats are going to be untaken because there's not enough demand for this particular game. Okay, so this is a nice example we're looking at if you look at any kind of sporting event or venue, because the supply or the capacity is set, but depending on the particular match or the particular game, the price will be determined by demand. So for part C, there's no secondary market because at that price, demand is already less than supply. Okay, one more example. So this one we're given a couple, we're given a supply and demand curve. We got to find the price and quantity, do a little algebra. All right, so let's suppose the demand and supply are given by these equations. So quantity demanded equals 50 minus P. So this you have a negative relationship between price and demand. And quantity supplied is given by 1/2 P minus 10. Okay? So you should note that for demand, every time the price goes up, demand goes down, and for supply, every time the price goes up, supply goes up. So given those simple equations, for some hypothetical supply and demand, part A, let's solve for the equilibrium pricing point. Okay, so you should know that at equilibrium, right, at equilibrium there's only one quantity in which supply and demand are equal. And so we can find that by just setting these two equal. Okay, so you know that at equilibrium, this has got to be equal to this. And we can find the price in which that occurs. So if this is equal to this at equilibrium, just set this equal to this and find the appropriate price, okay? So at equilibrium, 50 minus P equals 1 half P minus 10. We're just saying that supply equals demand or demand equals supply. And now let's just solve for that price, which would equate the supply and demand curve. Okay, so let's do just a little algebra. If you subtract 10 from both sides and you add P to both sides, you would get 3 halves P, 1 plus a half, equals 50 plus 10, which is 60. Then just multiply both sides by 2/3. Okay, so you get P equals 2/3 times 60. That simplifies to 120 over 3. And you get your market price, which has got to be $40. Okay, so you should know that at the market clearing price P star of 40, that supply should be equal to demand. So let's just put the price in the supply curve, put the price in the demand curve, and the result should be the same quantity. And if it is, that's our market quantity, that's our Q star. So let's plug in 40 into demand. Here we go. 50 minus P, put in the price of 40. 50 minus 40, and that gives us a market or a demand of 10. Now, is that also the case for supply? It should be. There's our supply curve. Let's plug in P equals 40 for the price. Alright, and 1 half of 40 is 20, and then minus 10. 20 minus 10 is 10, so you can see it's P star of 40. Quantity demanded is 10. Quantity supplied is 10. That's got to be the market quantity, so Q star, the market clearing quantity, is 10. Alright, and in part B, you can just state the effect of an increase in demand and a decrease in supply. Okay, so what happens to the new price and quantity? And remember, you can look at the chart or the example above. So you know that if demand goes up, if the curves go opposite directions, then you don't know what's going to happen to the new market quantity. Right? So if demand goes up, that's pushing upward pressure on the quantity, and if supply goes down, that's going the other direction. We don't know the magnitude, so therefore the effect on the new market quantity is ambiguous or indeterminate. Alright, so the same as the Q star question mark from the previous example. But you do know that if demand goes up, the consumers are willing to pay higher prices by definition. And if supply goes down, the suppliers are saying we need higher prices to supply now. Both those things push the price up, and so the new market price has to be higher. Okay, so a lot of examples here, but a lot of good stuff and concepts to cover. So any questions on any of these examples that we just went through? And all my answers are already posted on Blackboard. You can use those for your reference for any homework questions. Okay, let me just show you guys the homework for chapter 3. We'll go over that real quick, and then again, all the homeworks we've got to up to this point nothing's due until next Wednesday because I give you guys an extra week. And so let me pull up the homework, chapter 3 homework, and we'll cover this real quick. Okay, so there's the homework for chapter 3, which I think I opened. Okay, here you go. So there's 22 questions, which are very similar to the one we just did, the last one in the example. So you can look at that for reference. Alright, so in both of these, you've got a linear supply and a linear demand. You gotta set them equal and find the market clearing price and market clearing quantity. And then you gotta use the chart or just your logic to determine what happens if one curve goes this direction and the other curve goes that direction. And so there's two examples of that. So in both of these, set supply and demand equal, find price and quantity, and then state the effect of the changes. And then do the same for this one. Find the price and quantity like we just did, and then state the effect of Q star and Q star if this is the cost. Okay, so you can use the one we just did as a reference. Questions on what I want you to do here for the homework assignment? All right, so we're almost done with today's material. Let me just go over one more time what's due next week and what we're going to cover next week, and then we'll wrap things up for today. So let me just pull up the syllabus real quick. All right, so last week we did chapter 1 and chapter 2. We had those two pretty short homework assignments. Remember, I extended the deadline, so like I said in the email, homework chapter 1, chapter 2 homework, and chapter 3 homework, which we just looked at. All of those are due next Wednesday, September 16th. All right, so you have an extra week to do those because I know some people out of the class late and are still catching up. But you know, don't wait till the last minute. But you have an extra week to do all these assignments, and you know where those go. All right, so post your chapter 1 homework here, your chapter 2 homework here, and your chapter 3 homework here, and do that sometime before next Wednesday, or next Wednesday. And again, if you can put your homework in a Word, a Microsoft Word format or PDF, that would be easiest for me to look at. Yeah. Okay, so if there's no questions, and then next week we're gonna cover elasticity. So if you have a textbook and want to read ahead, we're gonna cover chapter 4. That'll be next week's topic and exercise and homework. So let me know if you have any questions on the homework or anything else. But I think that's all I have for tonight. And so thank you all for joining and hopefully learning something about supply and demand. And I'll see everyone in a week, next Wednesday, same time. So thank you.